Thank you all so much. It is great to be here with the USGLC, with an audience that cares deeply about the future of the country, both political and foreign and internationally. You come at an incredibly active and less certain times in foreign policy, and an incredibly active and also uncertain times in politics. It's a midterm election, as you all know. I wanted to look at the nexus between the two. It used to be how foreign policy stopped at the water's edge. We seem to have strayed from that over time. And what you find now is that the partisanship that has infused Washington in higher and higher degrees has also infused foreign policy. So what you find is that foreign policy has become in general, Republican versus Democratic thing. So of course it does play into the elections. Let me start first by saying that when I was thinking about this crowd and the American role overseas for Americans as individuals, for the America as a government, I remember the first trip that the president took overseas as president. It was for a G20, I think. I get the numbers mixed up because there's lots of Gs, but I think this was a G20. And the president came at a time when the economy, as you all remember, was horrible. Germany and France were pressing the US to accept global financial regulations. The president went and said, we have to accept part of our responsibility for what's happened in this global economic meltdown. And I remember watching this and thinking at the time, because I covered Ronald Reagan going to, when it was like the G8, and how prestigious the American thought was among those international leaders, that the clear leader of the group always was the American president at that point. And over time, that has become different. And when you indeed you have presidents that more and more have looked to multinational approaches to things, you find that the footing certainly seems far more equal. And you begin to kind of look at the word superpower in a different way. We're now finding out that this year, a new term I've now learned, the PPP, purchasing power parity. Right now, the U.S. is the leader. China, sometime this year, is expected to become that leader. So the U.S. position in the world, whether it's from private enterprises or from the government, definitely is changing as the world shrinks. The power becomes more and more spread out, and the U.S. Responds accordingly. Since 2009, the other limits of U.S. power, the world's only superpower at this point, have become readily apparent and have entered into the political zeitgeist, as we say. Whether it is a land grab of Crimea by Russia, the general souring of relationships with Russia, the continued reign of Bashar al-Assad, who 2-3 years ago, both the president and the Secretary of State said he must go. He's still there, just won an election. The disappointing blooms that came from the Arab Spring, the chaos that is still Libya, the march now through eastern Syria into western Iraq of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. So many things that Americans watch from their TV screens and wonder, what is the U.S. role here? What do we want? Including that, the non-movement in Israeli-Palestinian talks, which is no surprise to anyone. But in general, all of these things, it seems to me, rather than the kind of deep discussions that people would like to have about what is our role and the kinds of things I think probably you all do lots of times about where can we be helpful, how looking at new ways to be helpful, it has come down to the political realm. Because in general, how you feel about this president's foreign policy plays out pretty much like how you feel about this president's domestic policy. The GOP has been, many of them, knee-jerk in their criticism of the president, whatever it is he has done. They see, when they look at foreign policy, a retreat from the stage. Democrats have been blindly supportive, not seeing some of the chinks that a lot of folks see in the Obama doctrine. So that's the DC view. And then you look at, and you take it down to state by state. In Syria, critics say the president retreated from his red line promise. It allowed Bashar al-Assad to consolidate his power and to continue winning the war about at a time when it looked like the rebels might, with a push, be able to topple him. Now that seems very far away. If you look at supporters, they say, well, we've gotten rid of chemical weapons in Syria. These are deadly, horrible, banned weapons, so that's worth something. You look at Libya, which the Republicans saw as leading from behind, where supporters saw it as part of the multinational approach. So again and again, you see the political divide that now, if it does not drive foreign policy, it certainly drives the conversation of foreign policy. To supporters, this is a president who ended one war and is about to end another. To critics, this is a man who failed to get a deal and now is paying for it in what's going on in Iraq, and who is leaving Afghanistan too soon. So the dealing with Iran is another sort of point where everyone has hope for this, but the fact is that the president's critics think he is dealing with our enemies, and the president's supporters say, look, we're trying to find a diplomatic approach. This is a war-weary country, and we don't want to get into a big mess with Iran, which surely it would be. I think the public, in many ways, has a far more nuanced view than the politicians in Washington. If you look at the polls, let's take Crimea as an example. If you looked at the polling when it was at its height and you wondered what was going to happen to Crimea and Ukrainian elections, et cetera, the polling was that Americans did not want U.S. troops in the Ukraine, which was not suggested, but it was a polling question. So no U.S. troops in Ukraine. What the American public did support was the use of sanctions against Russia and the use of diplomacy, both of which President Obama did. You could go through country after country and you ask Americans, what would you like to do here? I imagine polling soon will be out about Iraq. I can almost guarantee you no U.S. troops on the ground in Iraq will be overwhelmingly supported. But what you see is when you say, do you support the president's handling of the Ukrainian crisis? Americans didn't. Even though they supported the elements of it, they didn't support his handling of it. So you now have a president at about 41, 42% approval of his handling of foreign policy, regardless of what it is. That's where you get into how it affects the upcoming election. Let me give you just a basic overview first of what we expect to happen in this election, and after Eric Cantor, what we expect to happen. I'm not sure is always valid, but I'll try to give you what the parameters are here. There's 36 Senate seats up by far. Maybe about 15 or 16 of them are vulnerable, and about 14 of those are democratically held seats. This is where the action is. You need the Democrats need 17 seats to take over in the House. No one thinks that's going to happen. So the action is for a 6-seat turnover to Republicans in the Senate, where Republicans would have a majority, and it would make for an interesting last 2 years for a Democratic president. So when you look at it, this is an election that can turn out one of three ways. It's hard to know right now which way this is going. The first is, usually midterm elections, particularly in the second term, are about the guy in the White House. And history is on the side of the Republicans here, because generally the party that's not in the White House can have big wins. So the history is on the side of Republicans. The numbers are on the side of the Republicans. The polling, the president's polling is below, he's underwater. He's below 50%. I think the last time I saw it was 45 or 46% approval rating. That's a drag. He may not be on the ticket, but he's kind of the ticket. This is where people go and tell you how they feel the general state of things. So in that way, if you look at it, the Democrats are in for a pretty rough ride. They're still raising some good money. They're still competitive in some places, but it does look pretty much like a Republican year. Add to that, however, the fact that you have an election year where right now, and they came out yesterday, Congress is now, I mean, the president's poll ratings are terrible. Congress's poll ratings are unbelievably bad. I mean, it is the lowest ever. So in the history of the Gallup poll, this was the lowest ever. So you think, okay, this is sort of the second scenario. This is the throw everybody out, right? This is the, we don't like, throw all the bums out. This is the anti-incumbent year then. What argues against that is that the vast majority of these seats in the House and the vast majority of the seats in the Senate are pretty solid. You've had this redistricting that has taken place 10 years ago. It generally, not 10 years ago, but the last time they did it, is now, you have really, really red districts. There were some, after 2012, I think Charlie Cook, who's a brilliant guy on politics, took a look at it and said, of those who ran and won by 55% or less, that was only 74 races. 74 of all the House races were won with 55% or less of the vote. Everything else was over that. Well, those are pretty solidly red and pretty solidly blue places. So there's not a lot of room for movement. It's in these same kind of 50, 60 seats in the House, these same kind of dozen, maybe 14 seats in the Senate that sometimes can turn over. But again, the Democrats are defending a lot more seats. They're defending a lot more, in the Senate side, a lot more seats and a lot more vulnerable seats. So the chances to throw the bums out sort of falls more heavily again on the Democrats. But it would keep the Republicans from taking over the U.S. Senate, which right now is the goal of the U.S. Senate, now run by Harry Reid, and of the White House. If this president gets a all-Republican Capitol Hill, it's just a rough ride for 2 years. Or, as a lot of students of history sometimes will tell you, wait, that's when they might get something done, because the Republicans don't want to roll into a presidential year not having accomplished something on Capitol Hill. Once you're in the leadership, you gotta produce something. So if they're in control of Capitol Hill and nothing gets done, what does that say about their ability to lead? So it could swing either way. I can assure you the White House would prefer that the Senate stay Democratic. You can have wave elections, perhaps, but I think we're a little bit done with wave elections. We had one in 2006, which, by the way, I think foreign policy played a big part in 2006. The country was sick of war. They had seen Katrina and the aftermath of Katrina and had essentially turned against a now reelected 2 years previous George Bush. But they took it out at the polls, and the Republicans lost 31 seats. That's a wave election. Net loss of 20 is generally considered a wave. So Republicans lost, that's 2006. 2010, we had Obamacare and the stimulus bill, another huge wave election. Democrats lost 63 seats. So I think the prospects for a wave election, despite this discontent, are very, very small. I think it looks more like you will see Democrats trying to turn this into local races. They will want to talk local issues with you, I can assure you, because the Democrats want this to be about how they service their district, what their district's folks want. International aid is a hard sell, I think you will all find out, because it's something that doesn't poll that well. People think that we spend oodles of money on international aid and international efforts, which is not the case compared to the rest of the budget. But the general perception by Americans, who do have an inward trend right now after 2 wars and 11 years, the general perception is too much money is being given to other countries. They don't see aid as the alternative to war. And that connection has not been made. They just see, hey, let these people take care of themselves. Why are we involved in the Middle East anyway? Yes, let's do the pivot to Asia, as the president's been wanting to do, because that's where the economy is, and that's where we need to bolster our own economy. You add to that an electorate that really is still very concerned about their own jobs, their own families. International affairs are way down there. In the end, when you look at the one polling number that really matters in this election, which again I think bodes well for Republicans, it's called the Right Direction, Wrong Direction poll. How do you think the country is doing? Now, it's June. The chances, I don't know if anybody of you remember when George Bush, the dad, was running. In June, everyone had the impression that the economy was really turning sour. This is for his reelection. By September, when we looked back, it was clear that the economy had actually turned and was getting better, but no one believed it. It was that June tends to hold. So this is kind of the waymark by which folks want to have the public impression on their side. So Bloomberg, I think, had the latest poll that I saw. And do you think the country is going in the right direction or the wrong direction? 26% said right direction. 64% said wrong direction. Are you satisfied or dissatisfied in the way the country's being run? 23% of Americans said, yeah, I'm satisfied. 74% said dissatisfied. When voters look at Washington, at this point, they look at who's in the White House. These aren't, the president's foreign policy numbers bleed into that. His approval ratings bleed into that. And it is what's making Democrats very nervous. In general, Americans do not vote on foreign policy unless there's an ongoing war. I think 2006 was a good example of when, in fact, it did matter. But this year, I think what's happened is that the general feeling, and you get this when you go out and talk to folks, not in Washington essentially, but outside Washington, you get this feeling that Americans feel that this shining city on the hill that Ronald Reagan talked about, that exceptional nation, American exceptionalism, that is dying. You see it when they say we think our kids are going to have a life that has not been as good as ours. First generation ever to think that right now. And that's where I think this foreign policy goes into that general feeling of right direction, wrong direction, because every time they turn on their TV, something seems to be going wrong. Now, look, if there's a deal with Iran and it really does get Iran to stop its nuclear ambitions, we all know things change on a dime. But the fact is, right now, as voters, insofar as they do look at foreign policy, it's impressionistic. And the impressionistic view right now is that he is mishandling. When you've got a 40% approval rating in foreign policy, they believe he's mishandling it. So it adds to this feeling of disillusionment about the president, and that is going to be reflected in the polls. It favors Republicans. I will tell you, the other thing is, when you look at some of these things, and in particular Benghazi and immigration, those are issues that drive Republicans to the polls. People who are upset vote. People who are happy sometimes think, oh, it's like I don't have time and things are fine, and they move on to their jobs. Angry people vote. And it's especially true in midterms where a lot fewer voters come out. That coalition that the president has been able to put together for 2 big election wins doesn't necessarily come out, particularly those voters, single women, minorities, their numbers drop considerably. It's why you're seeing so much on Capitol Hill that has to do with minimum wage and women's issues and climate change, because the president's doing his best, Congress doing its best to jack up the excitement for Democrats to try to get them to go out, because right now it's the angry people going to go, and the angry people are the critics of the president, and by and large that favors Republicans. So you're going to see the new Benghazi hearings probably late summer going right into the fall. So again, that's a voter turnout issue that certainly will drive Republicans to the polls. I think, in fact, that Benghazi, and I have differing views on why Eric Cantor lost, but certainly immigration and his seeming friendliness to the children of those undocumented workers who came because they came with their parents, and finding some way to give them a pathway to citizenship may have played a part. I think there were other things, but I think immigration as a whole, it used to be if you went to a Republican rally, they talked about one thing in a presidential year, and that was the Supreme Court. Because they wanted their guy in because they knew vacancies were coming up because of the age of whoever was on the Supreme Court, and that was all important to Republicans. Now you go and you hear a lot about Benghazi and you hear a lot about immigration because those are two real flashpoints for Republicans. Now in midterm elections, it is more liberal Democrats and more conservative Republicans who turn out. So again, that's why you're seeing climate change and various things that the president has been doing by executive order over time to sort of remind his base where he's headed. And it's a nice sort of way for them to try to get their voters out. I think exceptions to the way this is headed might be, you're already hearing talk that the march through Iraq right now by these very hardcore terrorists is a threat to America. If President Obama can rightfully say that his Boston bombing an exception, of course, that by and large, the kind of terrorist event that threw us on 9/11 has not happened. That his foreign policy in some ways has been quite muscular, certainly when it comes to drones, et cetera. And he can argue that. The question is, at this point, whether there's any direct line between what's happening on the battlefield in Iraq and what could happen to on U.S. shores. Lots of folks think that there's not the reach yet. That yes, this is a threat. These are people who would love to do harm to the U.S., but they don't have the wherewithal at this moment. So that'll have to play out. I doubt it'll play out in this election year, but it is something that I think is a subject they will continue. Republicans certainly will continue to revisit through 2016. And I want to make a brief mention of 2016 because I want to take your questions as well and see what's on your mind. So first of all, it's hard to even start a conversation about 2016 without a mention of Hillary Clinton, who's currently, I don't know if you've noticed, she's on a book tour. And she has a new book, and she's being interviewed by everybody. And, well, not everybody. Let's just say that's a sore point. But, I think elections tend to be like the pendulums. That one party is a reaction to the other party, and that so when you look at George W. Bush, where people criticized him for having this overly aggressive foreign policy, and then you see the pendulum swing with President Obama, where he's seen as kind of that leading from behind thing that came up during Libya and our response to that. And Republicans are pinning, whether you agree with it or not, I'm talking imagery here. And so you've seen, one criticized as overly aggressive, the other criticized as sitting on the sidelines and letting things just kind of happen. In the middle somewhere is probably where the next president will come from. I have the vaguest idea on the Republican side who's going to get in or what will happen. But if you look at Hillary Clinton and some of the things that have already happened, this is not exactly a run for the presidency right now, but it's sure a parallel universe. It's sure a tryout of some sort, because we already see her beginning to kind of push away just a little bit. She can't go but so far away from President Obama because she was the Secretary of State. But we're now looking at things in her book, Syria. She was one of the early supporters of arming some of the rebels, which they still say after 3 years, well, we're trying to figure out who we should give arms to. Most people think it's probably too late in Syria anyway at this point. She talked about how she urged the president to join in the Libyan effort when it was clear that France and Germany were going to go anyway, with or without the U.S., and so she urged him to join that. So we're beginning to see someone who I think is probably more muscular, if I can use that word, in foreign policy than President Obama is perceived to be, although you could certainly argue in drone policy and in other ways, certainly in NSA and clamping down on folks and monitoring folks. He's been every bit as muscular as George Bush has been. So I don't know if foreign policy will matter in the sense of it rarely does, but it feeds into how people vote. I mean, you all remember the 2 a.m., maybe you don't. If you don't live in Pennsylvania, maybe you don't, but or Ohio, the 2 a.m. phone call ad that Hillary put out in the last election, where she said, well, who do you want to have answer that phone? Do you want someone who's experienced, or do you want this other guy? And they took the other guy. And when you look at, people say, well, foreign policy experience really matters. I said, if foreign policy experience really matters, Bill Clinton would never have been president, because George H.W. Bush, the dad, had probably the best resume in politics. He'd been an ambassador, he'd been a UN ambassador, he'd been head of the CIA, he'd been a congressman, he'd been vice president for 8 years. I mean, so come on, this is not top on that list, but it somehow does feed into how folks vote. I think if I were to give you all some bit of advice, which of course I wouldn't, because I'm a journalist and I don't give advice, but if I were to give you advice, I would tell you that the connection between U.S. efforts, smart power, I guess you all are, Hillary Clinton calls it as well, but the connection between U.S. efforts at diplomacy, private groups. I once took this great trip with Hillary Clinton. As a matter of fact, it was after her husband had been impeached, after the impeachment trial, and after she was contemplating whether to run for the U.S. Senate, so the office said, hey, go with her. And it was a great trip. We went to Northern Africa, Morocco, and Egypt, and Tunisia, and various places like that. And one of the really interesting moments for me, she was there to support microloans. And it turned out to be a real women's trip, because what they had found, and these microloans are like $1,000. You give $1,000 to a family in the Atlas Mountains, and it can benefit the whole family. They buy, more hammers for the copper pottery, or they buy another sheep for the rugs, or they, et cetera. And one of the things they found, and no offense, because all of my sons are male, but they talked repeatedly, meaning the USAID people on the ground, about how they found when they gave the $1,000 to the women, it really benefited the family. They would go out and buy another sheep. And it really did make a difference in these towns in the middle of nowhere, because it would benefit their daughters who were trying to get educated, but they couldn't because there was no school nearby, et cetera, and so they could get a teacher into the village and all of that. And then when they gave it to the men, they'd go into town and spend it. So they found more and more that that little $1,000 just went so far. It doesn't take that much. And that kind of connection, there's nothing like helicoptering into the Atlas Mountains and seeing it happen, but that kind of connection made me understand where that aid really ought to be going on the individual to individual basis. And if you can somehow connect that, what you all are seeking from a congressman, why you think it's important, the more they will listen to that kind of thing, because it's, at this point, everybody wants an alternative to what's going on. But I don't think that most folks at the top of their list, because the public doesn't demand at the top of their list, is international aid or foreign aid. So if you make the connection to what it means there and how it changes this country from an impoverished group of young people with nothing to lose to families that grow, that is $1,000, $1,000 here and $1,000 there, maybe you find peace at some point. So I wish you good luck. I have some time for Q&A, which I hope you have. And good luck on Capitol Hill. You might want to stop off at Kevin McCarthy's office and just say hi to him, because I have a feeling he'll be an important Republican to have contacts with at some point. So thank you for your attention. You all were great. And there are, see this waving blonde? And over here, waving guy in a suit? Hi, go ahead over here.
Hi, Candy.
Hi.
Hi. My question is in regards to transparency. I think that's something that a lot of Americans always want, and I think that going into the midterms, that's something that Americans would want to see. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts are we haven't had very much. This was a president who, from any of them, but we're talking about this president who came to office saying, I'm going to be the most transparent presidency ever, and it hasn't been. I think that the presidency rightly changes folks. I'm a journalist. I am for tell us everything. So I'm a big proponent of transparency. I think that there has never, they need a transparency czar. They need some, committee somewhere that goes, why are we keeping this secret? What is this? But there's so much of it they're keeping secret, I think, because they're afraid they're going to let out something, terrible. But there's still, this administration, like all administrations, still have secret meetings, when they're trying to put legislation together, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think that when presidents get in office, particularly when it comes to intelligence and, what the NSA is gathering and all of that, I think that two things happen when someone comes new to the White House. Number one, they are immediately stunned that being the leader of the Western world is not really as powerful as it sounds. You have, that whole three branches of government thing actually is real. And I think the other thing that happens to them is they're more scared than they were. I understand that General Hayden has been a speaker to you all on occasion. I remember asking him on the air one time, because, he used to run the CIA and he knows all this stuff. And I said, so even if you can't tell me what you know, could you tell me, are you more scared than I am about what might happen in this world? And he said, oh, yeah, which was not really the answer. I wanted to say, no, it's all fine. So I think there are certain things that I give them in terms of, I get why you're keeping stuff secret, but they keep too much secret, particularly when it comes to how they formulate domestic policy. But they are afraid of the politics of it, and that's why they don't do domestic policy and let you know who they're meeting with and who's donating and who's, all of that. And I honestly think it's going to take, some changes in, for campaigns anyway, in disclosure. And I think it's going to take, Americans kind of demanding it. I think I hear more and more about this. I get more questions on transparency, which I think is great, but there's not a huge, demand for it. And it's a lot easier to keep secrets than to tell folks what you're doing and let your critics take pot shots at it, and I think that's why they never quite fulfill their promise.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Andy Warren, Bucks County, Pennsylvania. Two comments on your comments. One, I absolutely agree with you about the investment in giving the $1,000 to the woman, and it will really generate economic development. Right on target with that one. And you're right on that. However, concerning no seminal point like after Boston that may impact the election,
one more time.
I believe that perhaps the release of those 5 guys from Guantanamo may be the seminal point that will impact this election.
Gotcha. I meant to mention Sergeant Bergdahl and all of that, and I think you're right. It's June, and there's the attention span of folks who, right now, people are like having a summer. And they're, the kids are getting out of school and they're playing on the beach, and so in general, voters, certainly the more casual ones, are not paying as much attention. I agree with you that Bergdahl added to the, what did we do? We let, that kind of thing. I don't know. I know there will be hearings on it. I still think Benghazi has more power to motivate than Bergdahl does. But he certainly added, I think, to the mix of something just seems like we're not going in the right direction.
Hi, Candy. Colonel retired Chris Holshek with the We working here? Yeah. Hi, Candy. Colonel retired Chris Holshek with the Leadership Council of Veterans for Smart Power. Mm-hmm. My question is about the narrative, about language. You yourself in your presentation used the word muscular, which has a very positive connotation about the use of hard power. But when we talk about the use of what we call soft power, it's being soft or it's retreating and all those kind of things. We have a culture that overwhelmingly favors hard power. Just look at the video games our kids play, look at our Hollywood movies. The whole narrative, it's a fear narrative too. My question is with regard to the role of the media in helping to shape this narrative to a more balanced and nuanced sense instead of this sort of black and white world.
I have to say, first of all, I think if you look at the public, I think, first of all, there's always this false choice that comes out in the brevity of news that is, well, we either have to bomb them or do nothing, right? It's like that's what the argument's always about. And I'm thinking, yeah, but nobody holds either one of those positions, mostly, right? I mean, it's not, that's like there's something in between. There's other things that can be done. At this point, Americans are very, they don't want to send the military anywhere. I think the roughest thing would be for a president to have to explain why he did. So I don't think that Americans are pro the use of military at this point. I think they're actually very anti. I think they're inward much more than they're, hey, let's go fix this and fix this. I think they're realizing themselves, and do most of the time, that there are limits to American power in this brave new world. So I think that there is a difference between muscular and military. I think that you have to have, that you take nothing off the table, as they like to say at every White House, which generally means, no, we're not going to use military force, but we can't say we're not going to use military force because we're using that as, the stick. So I think that Obama has done a pretty good, I think Obama's done a pretty good job of exercising what you're talking about, because I think he's a believer in that. I just don't think he's done a very good job of explaining it, and of saying, here's what I'm doing over here. I'm sticking with this because this is a really important area, but here, we're gonna have to let them figure this out. For instance, he's now getting with Iraq. He said, well, the Iraqis have to figure this out for themselves. It's really their problem, where you've got on the other side people going, wait a second. No, these are a bunch of terrorists that want to kill Americans. We need to stop them before they get to Baghdad, which they better hurry. So I don't know that I agree with the premise that Americans, I get that, kids love video games and everything, but right now I think Americans are very war weary and want to avoid it at any cost, even if the cost was worth whatever the effort was. But I grant you that language is loosely used on the news and elsewhere, and that you have a point. I think muscular is a nice word just because it says, I'm ready. Don't doubt that I won't act. And I think that through the course of criticism, and through the course of some of his actions, the president has lost that second part. People doubt that he actually would act. So he's lost that kind of muscular feel. Mm-hmm.
Good evening. My name is Faduma Yusuf. Back to 2012 election, as Rami said, immigrants are 47%, which our community or the other immigrant took that 40% vote doesn't, count for his side, or he don't want it. So my question is, what are the suggestions you are going to give as a Republican Party to be engaged more in the people who are immigrated in this country, like DFLs, especially in Minnesota, where the most immigrated community live?
Okay, I'm not sure I totally, you want to know how you can get people more engaged?
I want to know the Republican Party, what are the suggestions you can give for the Republican Party to be more engaged for those people who are immigrated in this country?
How to get the Republican Party more engaged to those in the immigration? Is that
Yeah,
the?
yes.
Okay, gotcha. Oy, I can't, I don't have any, that's a trail I don't want to go down here in terms of giving party advice, and you'll be pleased to know they wouldn't take it anyway. So I think that the Republicans understand, every politician understands politics. And the politics and the demographics right now in the United States makes even 2016, which should be a year that favors Republicans. It's very tough to run for a third term, which should Hillary Clinton or any other Democrat run, it would be an Obama third term. It would be viewed as that. That's very hard to do. But with the changing demographics and the ascendant minorities, where soon we will have a nation that is a majority minority, that the Republicans understand this. My initial thought about immigration, and Republicans are quite happy to engage in what do we do with those who are already in this country that don't have papers. But again, it's that, well, let's first stop the flow. It has not helped that we now have these unaccompanied minors that are showing up at the border in twice the numbers that they did last year. That has given critics of finding a pathway to citizenship for those who are in the country more fodder to say, wait a second, we have to close the borders first and stop all of this, control the borders, not close the borders. So I think that the politics of the demographics, and by the way, immigration reform is supported by a vast majority of Americans. But the question is, like, when you get down to the specifics, do you agree with this and with this? That's where the argument always is. I unfortunately gave a speech right after President Obama won for his reelect, and said that in 2013 that we'd get immigration reform. So I'm not great at this. But I will say I've never thought we'd get it this year. I think insofar as Eric Cantor's defeat in his primary in Virginia is seen as his being soft on Dreamer children, I think there probably will not be immigration reform this year. But Republicans also want it to be part of a larger remake of legal immigration rules. They think that's crazy. It's a much larger effort. What Boehner has wanted to do all along, and how long he stays, I don't know, but has been to break it up into little pieces, but the Senate's got this big old giant bill. So they'd have to figure that out. But I don't think they're going to do it this year. Their caucus may get more conservative. It may not. But I do think because of the sheer numbers and the demographics that we can all see coming down the pike, that Republicans will eventually find some way. They tell you that they want to do it, and I believe them. They just don't want to do it the way it's currently being proposed. So we'll see what happens. Oh, wait, I'm over here. Sorry.
Hello, I'm Septina with UN Women, North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
My question is, do you think that U.S. will ever ratify CEDAW?
Okay, one more time. Ratify.
CEDAW, Convention on Elimination and Discrimination of All Women.
Boy, you're outside my knowledge zone here. Tell me about it.
Okay, so CEDAW is the ratification and the equality for all women globally, which is human rights and women's rights movement, and U.S. has not ratified it.
I don't know the specifics of why it's not been ratified. It sounds like something that the president might go for. Certainly we've heard Hillary Clinton talk about, her famous speech in China was about women's rights are human rights. I think someone told me that you earlier heard from speakers who all agreed that the power right now is with women. I don't know the specifics of the ins and outs of what you're talking about. The generality of it sounds to me like something whose time will come, but I don't know the specifics of it. But certainly I think there has been a seismic shift towards people realizing that women worldwide are not, in addition to still being exploited, but are still such an untapped resource that could make the world a better place. So it sounds to me like, from your brief description, like it would be something that would get ratified by the U.S., but I hate to, judge it by not knowing about the ins and outs. I'm sorry.
That's okay, but Palestine signed it.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Carlos from Nevada. Do you think there's a chance that Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren might run for the presidency?
Well, Elizabeth Warren has said $1 billion, and by the way, I have to wrap, this little sign here says, please wrap after this answer, so I just want you to know it's not my idea. This machine is telling me to do this. Elizabeth Warren has said quite a lot that she will not run for the presidency. Look, if Hillary Clinton doesn't run, all bets are off. You'll just see all kinds of people jump in. I think Martin O'Malley, the former, or still the governor of, but soon to be former governor of Maryland, may be in regardless for kind of like a maiden run. I mean, I think he'll do it. I think it would be a mistake for the Democrats to have a primary that went unchallenged. We all understand that Hillary Clinton looks formidable in the Democratic primary, but to not have a conversation would be kind of amazing to me. Bernie Sanders is an articulate spokesman for the left. He has been certainly on the president for a lot of different issues. And he could do that. There are different types of runs for the presidency. Some people run because they really want to be president. Everybody runs because they think they could be president. But a lot of people run to drive the conversation, that they want to pull whoever's going to win. If you're a Republican, generally folks get in to pull them a little bit to the right. If you're a Democrat, you get in to pull them a little more to the left. The left has been increasingly hard on President Obama, and certainly are disappointed in a lot of things he's done. That's why I say watch the things that are going on this year, because a lot of it is aimed at driving out the liberal base of the Democratic Party, which is basically the most disillusioned part of the Democratic Party. So I think, I don't know who it will be, but I think someone will get in and challenge Hillary Clinton from the left. There's space there, and the Democratic Party needs to have that conversation and needs to have her challenged, because she certainly will be challenged in a general election. Okay, see, they lied. Yes?
Cameron Parsons, a recent graduate of Brown University. A question for you regarding Republicans attacking Obama for leading from behind. How are they going to defend this going forward? And is this possibly a positive, a new direction for U.S. foreign policy?
Well, I think that that particular phrase applied to Libya, as it happens, which is currently a mess. But I think that they use that in the same way. A phrase comes up, it's like I was before I was against it. That just clung to John Kerry like Velcro. And I think this is one of those things that also wills, is we're leading from behind. You just think, really, that is just not something that should have come out of the mouth of anybody at the White House. And so they take it to mean, they have used that phrase to mean the U.S. is the world's only superpower. It is up to us to lead. It is our destiny to lead. It is back to the exceptionalism argument that you hear so much. American exceptionalism that we have through the free marketplace and capitalism and the worth of the individual over the worth of the state, that all of those things make the American system of democracy exceptional in this world, and therefore it needs to be defended and nurtured wherever that happens. And they see leading from behind as sitting on the sidelines. So I don't think it applies to any particular place. And whether it is a new era in diplomacy, a new era in, I mean, I think the days of sending bunches of troops and planes and tanks, and I think that's done, because now it's that whole asymmetric war thing, where it's this group that can be in Pakistan as easily as it could be in Iraq. You know, we're fighting these, we're not fighting states so much as groups. So that certainly has changed, and that requires negotiations with states, because we need their help to get rid of those who would be hostile to American interests. So I think the nature of the world has changed, but I don't think the complaint or the feeling, which I think actually most Americans share, which is most Americans still believe this is an exceptional nation, that in its ideals, maybe not in its practice, but in its ideals, America is an exceptional nation. And I think that's why it's disappointing to them to watch all this sort of play out. I don't think they think of it as, hey, the world's changed and there's only so many things we can affect. I think they look at it and think, well, why can't we do something about it, short of sending, you know, military troops? But I think one of the reasons you see all the changes at the Pentagon is that they know that war, as we've come to know it, is not how we will fight it in the future. Now it's about intelligence and counterinsurgencies and counterterrorism groups and special ops and all those kinds of things. So the world has changed, and diplomacy is going to change, because in the end, look, we're talking to Iran. I mean, we're talking to Iran about Iraq. I mean, that's, you know, that's like taking crazy pills. So, you know, and yet if they can be useful, I mean, they've been very clear about, yeah, but we're not going to coordinate military stuff. We just, if they can be helpful, we'd like them to be helpful. And Iran may be. So the world changes, nations change, leaders change, and it's very hard to predict like where you go, but I do think that leading from behind is a catchphrase that critics use to say we need to be more bullish about democracy and what we believe is the right of every individual that lives on this earth. Thanks. Thank you all very much.